I remember the weight of that Tuesday evening like it happened yesterday, though it's been years now since I sat at that kitchen table with my life spread out before me in careful, desperate pieces. The rental house had never felt like home, but that night it felt especially hollow, like a stage set waiting for actors who would never arrive. I had set the table for two out of habit, the way I'd done for nearly 15 years of marriage. 2 plates, 2 napkins, 2 wine glasses catching the last amber light filtering through the window blinds. But Elaine's chair sat empty, had been empty for 6 months now, and her wine glass remained untouched, a monument to conversations we would never have again. The silence in that kitchen was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that presses against your chest, that makes you aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat, the small sounds of a house settling around the weight of one person's loneliness. I could hear the refrigerator humming, the distant murmur of a television from the neighbor's house, the soft tick of the wall clock marking time I didn't know how to fill. Against the far wall, the half-packed cardboard box leaned like a tired traveler. Inside were the remnants of what we used to call our life together. Wedding photos in silver frames, a set of china we'd received as a gift and used maybe twice. Books with both our names written inside the covers in careful script. I'd started packing it weeks ago, but couldn't bring myself to finish. Some endings, I'd learned, resist completion. The wedding ring felt heavier than it should have when I finally pulled it from my finger. 18 years of wearing it had left a pale band of skin underneath, a ghost of the man I used to be. For weeks I'd been staring at that ring, rolling it between my fingers, wondering when it had stopped feeling like a promise and started feeling like a shackle. I set it on the table next to the unopened bottle of wine, the small metallic clink against the wood unnaturally loud in the stillness. There it sat, catching the overhead light, a perfect circle that had once meant everything and now meant only the end of pretending. The wine was a bottle Elaine and I had been saving for our anniversary, though which anniversary I could no longer remember. It had sat in our kitchen cabinet for years, gathering dust and false hope, waiting for a celebration that would never come. Now it seemed absurd, this expensive bottle watching over the ruins of what we'd tried to build together. I was studying that ring, lost in the weight of what it represented when the knock came. 3 gentle raps against the front door, nothing urgent or demanding, just the sound of someone with legitimate business at an inconvenient hour. I considered not answering, letting whoever it was assume I wasn't home, but something about the timing felt too coincidental to ignore. Adrian stood on my doorstep with a manila folder in his hand and an apologetic expression on his face. He said there was an issue with the lease renewal, something that couldn't wait until morning, and could he come in for just a moment. I stepped aside to let him enter, suddenly conscious of the wine glasses, the ring on the table, the box against the wall like evidence of a crime I wasn't ready to confess. But when our eyes met in the hallway light, something shifted. I felt my carefully constructed facade crack, just slightly, like ice beginning to give way under unexpected pressure. He was looking at me not with the polite detachment of a landlord conducting business, but with something softer, more curious. It lasted only a moment, that look, but it was long enough for me to feel exposed, seen in a way I hadn't been in months. He lingered longer than necessary, asking about the house, about whether I was settling in well, about whether I needed anything repaired or replaced. I found myself hiding the evidence of my unraveling life, sliding the ring into my pocket, turning the wine glasses away from view, making small talk about the weather and the neighborhood while my heart hammered against my ribs. When he finally left, I closed the door and leaned my back against it, exhaling a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The house settled back into its familiar silence, but something fundamental had shifted. In the space of 10 minutes, Adrian had seen through the performance I'd been giving for months, the careful choreography of a man who was fine, who was managing, who didn't need anything from anyone. Something had happened in those few minutes, something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. The way he'd looked at me, the way his presence had filled the small hallway, the way I'd felt compelled to hide the evidence of my dissolution like a teenager hiding contraband from his parents. The man I had been before he knocked was not quite the same man who now stood alone in the hallway, and I knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified me, that my carefully ordered world had just shifted on its axis. The days that followed Adrian's unexpected visit fell back into the rhythm I had cultivated since Elaine left, a careful choreography of ordinary moments designed to fill the hours without demanding too much of my heart. I was 43 years old and had become an expert at living in the margins of my own life, existing in the spaces between what I was supposed to want and what I actually felt. My mornings began at 6:15 with coffee that was always too strong and toast that was always slightly burnt, small imperfections I'd stopped bothering to correct. The drive to Franklin High School took exactly 12 minutes, long enough for the local news to cycle through weather and traffic, not long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable. I taught 11th grade English in room 237, the same classroom I'd occupied for nearly 2 decades, surrounded by the same faded motivational posters and the same worn copies of books I'd once believed could change the world. My students respected me in the way teenagers respect consistency. I was Mr. Harrison, the teacher who never raised his voice, who graded papers with meticulous precision, who could recite passages from Whitman and Dickinson with a passion that surprised them. They saw me as steady, reliable, maybe a little boring. They had no idea that standing before them each day, discussing themes of love and loss and the courage to live authentically, felt like an elaborate performance I'd been rehearsing my entire adult life. The faculty lounge conversations swirled around me like background noise. My colleagues spoke of weekend plans, family vacations, children's soccer games, the comfortable complaints of people whose lives had shape and purpose. I contributed when spoken to directly, asked polite questions about their marriages and mortgages, but I could feel the distance between us like a physical thing. They regarded me as pleasant but distant, professionally competent but personally unknowable. If they noticed the absence of stories about my wife, the lack of photos on my desk, the way I declined invitations to dinner parties and holiday gatherings, they were too polite to comment. The house I rented sat in a neighborhood designed for families, tree-lined streets where children rode bicycles and neighbors borrowed lawn mowers, and Friday evenings meant backyard barbecues and the sound of laughter drifting over fence lines. I moved through this landscape like a ghost, nodding to people whose names I'd never learned, existing on the periphery of a life I'd never quite figured out how to enter. The rental itself was a modest 2-bedroom colonial with cream-colored walls and beige carpeting, the kind of neutral palette that offended no one and inspired nothing. When I'd first moved in, I told myself it was temporary, a way station while Elaine and I figured out what came next. 6 months later, boxes still lined the walls like cardboard monuments to my inability to commit to any version of the future. Photographs remained hidden in drawers, books stayed in boxes, and the walls remained bare except for a single framed print of a lighthouse I'd bought at a gas station, because it seemed like the kind of thing a divorced man living alone should hang in his kitchen. The most unsettling part of living there wasn't the silence or the emptiness or even the constant reminder that this wasn't really my home. It was the sound of footsteps overhead, the quiet evidence that someone else lived above my garage, someone who seemed to move through his space with purpose and ease. Adrian Novak had inherited the property from his father along with 2 others in the neighborhood, and he'd converted the space above my detached garage into a small apartment where he lived while managing his properties and running his carpentry business. Our interactions had been limited to practical matters: the monthly rent check, a clogged drain in the bathroom, a light fixture that had stopped working in the hall. He was unfailingly polite and efficient, arriving promptly when called, fixing whatever needed fixing with the kind of quiet competence that suggested he could probably rebuild the entire house if necessary. He was probably in his early 40s, with the kind of weathered hands that spoke of actual work and the easy posture of someone comfortable in his own skin. What struck me most about Adrian wasn't what he said, but what he didn't say. He never asked about Elaine, never commented on the boxes or the general air of impermanence that hung over the place. He simply did what needed doing and left me to whatever version of privacy I was trying to maintain. But I found myself listening for him in the evenings, the sound of his footsteps crossing the floor above, the murmur of music or television filtering down through the ceiling, the comforting evidence that someone nearby knew how to be at home in the world. Sometimes I caught the scent of wood shavings on his clothes when he came to the door, or noticed sawdust clinging to his work boots, and I would imagine him in his workshop, hands shaping something useful and beautiful from raw lumber. There was something deeply appealing about that kind of work, the way it produced tangible results, objects that would last, and serve a purpose long after the maker was gone. It seemed like the opposite of teaching literature to teenagers who would forget most of what I told them within a year, the opposite of grading papers that would be thrown away, the opposite of a marriage that had produced nothing lasting except the mutual agreement that we had both been pretending for longer than either of us cared to admit. The strange thing was how aware I'd become of his presence without ever really speaking to him beyond the necessities of landlord and tenant. I knew the rhythm of his days by the sounds that drifted down. The early morning shower, the truck starting in the driveway, the evening return when his footsteps would cross overhead like a familiar melody. Sometimes I heard him playing guitar, just finger-picking soft melodies that seemed to float through the floorboards like gentle rain. Other nights, there was the sound of hammering or sawing, projects that ran late into the evening, the kind of work that suggested passion rather than mere necessity. It was oddly comforting, this evidence of another person living a real life so close to my careful half-existence, like having a neighbor whose contentment you could sense through the walls without having to participate in it yourself. I began to time my own movements around his, making dinner when I heard him come home, taking my evening walk when his lights came on upstairs, as if I could absorb some small portion of his apparent ease with solitude through proximity alone. I told myself this awareness was nothing more than the natural curiosity of someone living in close quarters with a stranger. But if I was being honest, there was something about Adrian that made me feel both more and less alone than I had in months. More alone because his presence reminded me how little company I was for myself, how empty my evenings felt in comparison to whatever purposeful life he was living overhead. Less alone because those footsteps, that guitar, even the sound of his truck in the driveway became a kind of soundtrack to my days, proof that somewhere very close, someone had figured out how to inhabit their life instead of merely enduring it. The storm arrived on a Thursday night in late October, announced first by the restless energy that always precedes serious weather, the way the air seems to hold its breath before letting loose. I was grading essays at the kitchen table when the first fat raindrops hit the windows, each one sounding like a small stone thrown against the glass. Within minutes, the gentle percussion had become a steady drumming, then a thunderous assault that made conversation with myself impossible. I had always found storms oddly comforting, the way they gave permission to stay inside, to light candles, to feel cozy and protected while nature raged just beyond the walls. But this one felt different, more urgent, as if the universe had decided that my careful routine needed disrupting. The wind picked up, sending leaves and small branches skittering across the yard, and then came the thunder, deep rolling crashes that seemed to shake the foundation of the house. I was making tea when I heard it, a soft plinking sound that didn't belong to the symphony of wind and rain outside. I looked up to see a dark stain spreading across the kitchen ceiling, and even as I watched, a drop of water gathered at its center and fell into the sugar bowl I'd left on the counter. Then another, and another. Within minutes, I had emptied the sugar bowl and positioned it under the leak, but the stain was growing, and the drops were coming faster. I found a larger pot, then a mixing bowl, moving them around as new leaks sprouted like some kind of domestic hydra. The ceiling, which had seemed solid and permanent just an hour before, now appeared to be barely holding back the storm. I stood there for a moment, listening to the irregular rhythm of water hitting metal, feeling helpless in the face of something I had no idea how to fix. In my marriage, Elaine had always been the one to handle household crises, to know which numbers to call and what words to use to convey urgency without panic. I realized, with a kind of embarrassed clarity, that I didn't even know if Adrian had given me an emergency contact number. But when I called the number I had for him, he answered on the second ring, his voice immediately alert despite the late hour. I explained about the leak, apologizing for the timing, for the inconvenience, for the fact that I probably should have known what to do myself. He interrupted me gently. He said he'd be right down, that these things happened, that I shouldn't worry about it. He arrived within minutes, hair damp from the sprint across the yard, wearing a flannel shirt that looked like he'd thrown it on over pajamas. He carried a toolbox that seemed impossibly heavy for its size and moved through my kitchen with the kind of practiced efficiency that made me feel both grateful and incompetent. We worked together to move the table and chairs away from the spreading damage, our movements awkward at first as we navigated around each other in the small space. There was something almost intimate about the crisis, the way it forced us into a kind of partnership I hadn't expected. When he handed me one end of the table, our fingers brushed briefly, and I felt something electric that had nothing to do with the storm outside. When he stood on a chair to examine the ceiling more closely, I found myself watching the way his shoulders moved under his shirt, the careful way he probed the damaged plaster, and I had to look away before he caught me staring. We filled every pot and bowl I owned, creating a small percussion section in the middle of my kitchen. The absurdity of it hit us both at the same time. This grown man's apartment turned into some kind of avant-garde art installation, and we started laughing. Not the polite laughter of landlord and tenant, but something genuine and unguarded, the kind of laughter that comes when two people recognize they're in something together, however temporarily. The storm began to ease around midnight, the thunder moving off to torment some other neighborhood, the rain settling into a steady but manageable rhythm. Adrian climbed down from the chair, where he'd been applying some kind of temporary patch, and surveyed our handiwork with satisfaction. The immediate crisis was over, but we both knew the real work would have to wait for daylight and dry weather. He was putting his tools away when he suggested I come upstairs while we waited to see if the patch would hold. He said it matter-of-factly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, but I felt my pulse quicken at the invitation. I had never been inside his apartment, had only imagined what it might look like based on the sounds that drifted down through the floor. The space above the garage was modest, but immediately felt like home in a way my own place never had. Books lined makeshift shelves along one wall, their spines showing the comfortable wear of volumes that had been read and reread. Photographs covered another wall, images of fishing trips and hiking adventures, friends gathered around campfires, moments of genuine joy captured and displayed without self-consciousness. In one corner, a guitar leaned against the wall, its wood polished smooth by use. Sheet music scattered on a small table nearby. Everything in the room seemed chosen with care rather than merely acquired. The furniture was mismatched but harmonious, pieces that looked like they had stories behind them. A quilt that might have been handmade draped over the back of a worn leather chair. A coffee table made from what looked like reclaimed wood held a neat stack of magazines and a half-finished crossword puzzle. It was the home of someone who had taken the time to create a space that reflected who they actually were rather than who they thought they should be. He made coffee in a French press, the kind of attention to the process that suggested this was ritual rather than mere caffeine delivery. We sat across from each other at a small table near the window, steam rising between us like incense. And for the first time in months, I felt the peculiar comfort that comes from being in a space where someone else is genuinely at ease. The conversation started with practical matters, how long the repair might take, whether I'd need to move out temporarily, the logistics of dealing with insurance and contractors. But somehow we drifted into other territory. The books on his shelves, the music he played, the way he'd learned carpentry from his father who'd believed that working with your hands was a form of prayer. I found myself talking about my students, about the way literature could crack open something essential in a 17-year-old who thought they had nothing to learn from dead poets. There was something about the late hour, the intimacy of the crisis we'd just weathered together, the warmth of the small apartment that made conversation feel both easy and profound. I told him things I hadn't said aloud in years. How I'd become a teacher because I'd believed in the transformative power of words, how I sometimes felt like I was performing my own life rather than living it, how the last few months had been both the loneliest and the most honest of my adult life. He listened without judgment, asked questions that suggested he was actually hearing what I was saying rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. When he talked about his work, about the satisfaction of building something that would outlast him, about inheriting his father's properties and trying to be the kind of landlord his father had been, I heard something in his voice that I recognized, the sound of someone who had found a way to align what they did with who they were. It was nearly 2 in the morning when I finally said I should go, that we both had work in the morning, that I'd taken up enough of his evening. He walked me to the door, and as I was thanking him for everything, for coming down in the storm, for the coffee, for the conversation, he said something that stopped me in my tracks. He said I didn't have to sit alone downstairs all the time, that his door was always open. He said it casually, as if he were commenting on the weather, but something in his voice suggested he meant it as more than simple neighborly politeness. The words hung between us for a moment, heavy with possibility, and I felt something shift in my chest, a kind of recognition that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I thanked him again and made my way back down to my apartment, where the pots and bowls were still catching the last drops from the ceiling. But as I cleaned up the evidence of the evening's crisis, I found myself thinking not about the damage or the repair work that lay ahead, but about the way Adrian had looked at me when he'd spoken those last words, as if he'd been offering something much more significant than shelter from the storm. In the days that followed the storm, I found myself accepting Adrian's invitation with a frequency that surprised us both. It started innocently enough. He knocked on my door 2 nights later to check on the ceiling repair, and when he mentioned he was making pasta, I found myself saying yes when he asked if I'd like to join him. The meal was simple but prepared with care, the kind of cooking that spoke of someone who had learned to nourish himself properly, who understood that eating alone didn't have to mean eating poorly. We sat at his small table as October darkness gathered outside the windows, talking about everything and nothing with the easy rhythm of people who had discovered they genuinely enjoyed each other's company. He asked about the books I'd been grading, about my favorite poets, about whether I still believed in the power of literature to change lives. These were questions no one had asked me in years, and I felt something long dormant stirring in my chest as I tried to answer them honestly. What struck me most was how he listened. Not the polite, distracted listening of cocktail party conversation, but the kind of attention that made me feel like my words mattered, like my thoughts were worth the time it took to express them properly. When I mentioned that I'd been rereading Whitman lately, finding comfort in his celebration of ordinary moments, Adrian asked me to recite something I loved. I felt self-conscious at first, but something in his expression encouraged me, and I found myself speaking those familiar lines about containing multitudes, about the simple fact of being alive being enough reason for joy. The evening stretched longer than either of us had planned, and when I finally said I should go, I realized I didn't want to. This became our pattern. Casual invitations that extended into conversations that lasted until one of us noticed how late it had become. Sometimes he cooked. Sometimes I brought takeout from the Thai place near school. Sometimes we simply shared whatever we had on hand. The food became secondary to the talking, and the talking became something I looked forward to with an intensity that both thrilled and worried me. I began to notice how much I was listening for his footsteps overhead, timing my own movements around his. When I heard his truck pull into the driveway in the evenings, I would find myself checking my appearance in the bathroom mirror, straightening my shirt, running a hand through my hair, as if preparing for something significant. I told myself this was simple courtesy, the natural impulse to look presentable for a neighbor, but I knew I was lying. The sound of his knock at my door became the best part of my day, and on the evenings when it didn't come, I felt a disappointment that seemed disproportionate to the situation. I would find myself inventing reasons to go outside when I knew he was working in his shop, hoping for a casual encounter that might lead to conversation. I felt like a teenager with a crush, except I was 43 years old and supposedly knew better. The attraction grew in silence, threaded through glances that lasted a beat too long, pauses in conversation that felt heavy with unspoken possibility. When we passed each other tools or dishes, when we reached for the same book on his shelf, the accidental brush of fingers became electric, charged with something I didn't know how to name or navigate. I found myself studying his hands as he spoke, the way they moved when he gestured, the calluses that spoke of real work, the careful way he handled fragile things. There were moments when I caught him looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something warmer than friendship, but more complex than simple attraction. During one of our late-night conversations about the books that had shaped us, he mentioned a novel about two men who found each other late in life, and the way he spoke about it made me wonder if he was trying to tell me something. But when I looked up from my coffee, his expression was neutral, and I convinced myself I had imagined the undercurrent. I rediscovered the sound of my own laughter during those evenings with Adrian, the genuine kind that comes from the belly rather than politeness. He had a dry sense of humor that caught me off guard, a way of finding absurdity in everyday situations that made me see my own life from new angles. When he told stories about his more eccentric tenants, or about the projects that had gone comically wrong, I found myself laughing until my sides ached, feeling lighter than I had in months. But beneath the joy was a current of fear that grew stronger as the weeks passed. This warmth I felt in Adrian's presence, this anticipation that colored my days, this growing awareness that I looked forward to seeing him more than anything else in my carefully ordered life. None of it fit the script I had been following for 43 years. This was not what I had been taught to want, not what my marriage had represented, not what my colleagues or family or anyone who knew me would ever expect. I found myself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling through which I could sometimes hear Adrian moving around above me, trying to understand what was happening to me. The feelings were undeniable but terrifying, like discovering a room in your house you never knew existed, a space that changed the entire architecture of everything you thought you understood about yourself. There was a quality of awakening to those weeks that felt both exhilarating and dangerous. I felt more alive than I had in years, more engaged with the world around me, more present in my own life. My students noticed the change, commenting that I seemed more energetic, more passionate about the material we were covering. I found myself assigning poems about love and longing with a new understanding of their weight, their power to capture the beautiful confusion of the human heart. But I also felt ancient, weighted down by decades of living according to other people's expectations, by the accumulated habit of being someone I wasn't sure I actually was. The gap between the person I had been and the person I was becoming felt vast and uncrossable, like standing on one side of a canyon and seeing the life you wanted on the other side, but having no idea how to build a bridge. One evening in early November, as we sat sharing a bottle of wine Adrian had opened to celebrate finishing a particularly challenging cabinet project, he asked me about Elaine. The question came out of nowhere, gentle but direct, and I felt something in my chest tighten. I had avoided talking about my marriage, partly out of habit and partly because I wasn't sure how to explain the peculiar emptiness that had characterized those years. I found myself telling him things I had never said aloud, about how Elaine and I had lived like careful roommates toward the end, about how we had both been going through the motions of being married without either of us being willing to admit that the foundation had crumbled years before. I told him about the relief I had felt when she finally left, the guilty gratitude for being released from a performance that had exhausted us both. Adrian listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions that helped me understand my own experience more clearly. When I finished talking, he was quiet for a long moment, swirling the wine in his glass, and then he said something that stopped my breath. He said it sounded like I had never really had the chance to figure out what I actually wanted, that I had spent so much time being what other people needed me to be that I might not even know who I was when no one was watching. The words hit me with the force of recognition, as if he had just diagnosed something I had been carrying for years without knowing it had a name. I felt tears threaten, an emotional response that surprised me with its intensity, and I had to look away to compose myself. When I looked back, Adrian was watching me with such kindness that I felt something crack open in my chest, some long-held tension finally beginning to release. That night, As I walked back down to my apartment, I felt both young and ancient, like someone awakening to something beautiful, but terrified it might be taken away before I had the courage to claim it. The man I had been for 43 years felt like a costume I was finally ready to remove, but I had no idea what lay underneath, or whether I would have the strength to become whoever that person might be. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in late November, 3 weeks after that conversation about Elaine had left me feeling exposed and strangely grateful. Adrian had returned to work on the kitchen ceiling, the temporary patch he'd applied during the storm finally ready to be replaced with proper repair. I had offered to help, though we both knew I would be more hindrance than assistance, and he had accepted with the patient smile of someone who understood that the offer itself mattered more than the practical value. I watched him work from my position at the kitchen counter, ostensibly useful as the keeper of tools and supplier of coffee, but really just mesmerized by the easy competence with which he moved. He had rolled up the sleeves of his work shirt, and I found myself studying the play of muscles in his forearms as he reached overhead, the careful precision of his movements as he measured and cut and fitted pieces into place. There was something almost meditative about watching someone who truly knew what they were doing, who could transform chaos into order with nothing but skill and patience. The late afternoon light slanted through the kitchen window, catching the sawdust that drifted down from his work and turning it into something almost magical, like snow falling indoors. The air smelled of fresh lumber and the faint cologne he wore, a combination that had become inextricably linked in my mind with safety and warmth and the possibility of being truly seen by another person. I had been holding a screwdriver he might need when our eyes met. He had paused in his work to ask for something, and when he looked down at me from his perch on the stepladder, something passed between us that felt different from all the glances that had come before. There was a weight to it, a kind of recognition that made my breath catch in my throat. For a moment that felt like an hour, we simply looked at each other, and I felt the careful walls I had built around my heart beginning to crumble. The intensity of that moment scared me, and I broke eye contact first, busying myself with arranging tools that didn't need arranging, trying to pretend that my hands weren't shaking. But I could feel his gaze lingering on me even as he returned to his work, and I knew that something fundamental had shifted between us, something that couldn't be taken back or explained away as mere friendship. The repair took longer than expected, which meant Adrian was still there as evening settled over the house. We worked by lamplight in the final hour, the warm glow making the kitchen feel intimate and separate from the rest of the world. When he finally climbed down from the ladder and surveyed his handiwork with satisfaction, I felt a strange mixture of relief that the job was done and disappointment that our reason for being together in this charged silence was coming to an end. He gathered his tools with his usual methodical care while I attempted to restore some order to the kitchen. We moved around each other in the small space with a kind of choreographed awareness, each hyper-conscious of where the other was, of the electric possibility that seemed to fill the air between us. When he handed me the dustpan, our fingers brushed, and neither of us pulled away immediately. The contact lasted only seconds, but it felt like a confession. As he prepared to leave, I walked him to the door, following a ritual we had established over the weeks of shared meals and conversations. Usually, this was when we would make plans for the next evening, when one of us would extend a casual invitation that we both understood meant more than it seemed to. But tonight felt different, heavier with unspoken possibility and the weight of whatever had passed between us while he worked. He paused at the door, his hand on the handle, and turned back to face me. In the porch light, his expression was serious, almost searching, as if he were trying to read something in my face that I wasn't sure I was ready to write. The silence stretched between us, filled with all the words neither of us seemed brave enough to speak. I began to thank him for the repair work, for staying so late, for all the evenings he had spent listening to me talk about poetry and loneliness and the strange geography of a life half-lived. But the words felt inadequate, too small to contain what I was actually feeling, which was a kind of desperate gratitude for his presence in my carefully ordered emptiness. He didn't move to leave, and I didn't step back to give him space. We stood there in the doorway, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough that I could smell the sawdust in his hair. The moment felt balanced on a knife's edge, trembling with possibility and terror in equal measure. That's when the truth spilled out of me, unbidden and unstoppable. I heard myself saying that I didn't know what this was between us, whatever this feeling was that made me look forward to his knock at my door more than anything else in my week. I said I didn't know how to name it or navigate it, or even whether I had the right to feel it, but I knew I was tired of pretending it wasn't there. The words came out in a rush, barely coherent, but carrying the weight of months of careful suppression. I told him I didn't want to pretend anymore, that I was exhausted by the performance of being someone I wasn't sure I had ever actually been. My voice was shaking, and I felt exposed in a way that was both terrifying and necessary, like stepping out of shelter into a storm, but finally being able to breathe freely. Adrian didn't speak immediately. He simply stood there, taking in what I had said, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I was certain I had ruined everything, that I had taken our careful friendship and shattered it with my inability to keep my feelings contained. I began to apologize, to take back the words, to restore us to the safe territory of landlord and tenant. But then he moved, slowly and deliberately, reaching out to place his hand over mine where it rested against the doorframe. His touch was steady and warm, grounding in a way that made me feel less like I was falling and more like I was finally finding solid ground. He didn't pull away, didn't flinch, didn't offer the kind of awkward reassurance that would have meant he was trying to let me down gently. Instead, he said my name, just my first name, but in a tone I had never heard him use before, soft and certain and completely unafraid. The sound of it seemed to settle something in my chest that had been restless for months, maybe years. What happened next felt both inevitable and impossible. He leaned toward me, and I didn't step back. His free hand came up to cup my face, his thumb brushing across my cheek with a gentleness that made my eyes burn with unshed tears. For a moment, we simply breathed the same air, sharing the space between possibility and reality. And then he kissed me, softly at first, almost tentatively, as if he were asking a question. But when I kissed him back, when I let myself respond to this gift I had never dared to hope for, the kiss deepened into something that felt like coming home and leaving everything I had ever known simultaneously. I felt the terror of exposure, the panic of standing naked in a life I had never admitted wanting. But stronger than the fear was the relief, the overwhelming sense of recognition that flooded through me as I finally understood the shape of my own truth. This was what I had been missing, what I had been searching for in all those years of careful performance and polite emptiness. This connection, this rightness, this feeling of being completely known and accepted. When we finally broke apart, I was trembling, but not from fear. For the first time in my adult life, I felt completely present in my own body, completely honest about what I wanted. Adrian's forehead rested against mine, his breathing as unsteady as my own, and in the silence that followed, I knew that whatever came next, I could never go back to pretending I was someone I wasn't. The man I had been before that kiss felt like a stranger, someone I had worn like an ill-fitting suit for decades. Standing there in the doorway with Adrian's hand still warm against my face, I finally understood what it felt like to inhabit my own life instead of simply enduring it. The days following that kiss felt like living in two worlds simultaneously. There was the world where I moved through my usual routines, teaching classes and grading papers and nodding to neighbors, performing the role of Nathaniel Harrison with the same competence I had always managed. And then there was the other world, the one that existed in the space between Adrian's apartment and mine, where I was someone I had never been before, someone who knew the taste of desire and the weight of authentic choice. I found myself studying my reflection in the bathroom mirror each morning, searching for visible evidence of the transformation I felt happening inside me. But the face that looked back was the same one I had worn for 43 years, and that disconnect between internal revolution and external continuity left me feeling unmoored, as if I were living in someone else's life by accident. The fear came in waves. usually in the early hours of the morning when sleep wouldn't come and my mind cataloged all the ways this new truth could destroy everything I had built. My colleagues at school, who respected me for my steadiness and professionalism, what would they think if they knew? The parents of my students, who trusted me with their children's education, would they question my fitness to teach? My own family, scattered across different states, but bound by shared expectations of who I was supposed to be. How could I explain this fundamental revision of everything they thought they knew about me? And then there was Elaine, who still called occasionally with practical questions about taxes and insurance, maintaining the polite fiction that our separation was temporary, that we were both just taking time to figure things out. How could I tell her that I hadn't been figuring anything out, but finally admitting something I had perhaps always known but never had the courage to face? Adrian seemed to understand my struggle without needing it explained. During our conversations in the weeks that followed, he was patient but clear about what he saw happening. He told me that I had to decide what kind of life I wanted to live, not for him, not for anyone else, but for myself. He said this without pressure or ultimatum, but with the quiet firmness of someone who had learned the cost of living authentically and wasn't willing to settle for anything less. We continued our evening meals, but they were different now, charged with the knowledge of what we had shared and the question of what came next. Sometimes we talked about the practical realities of two men in their 40s choosing each other in a world that didn't always make space for such choices. Other times we simply sat in comfortable silence, the weight of possibility settling around us like snow. He told me about his own journey, about coming to terms with who he was in his late 20s, about the relationships that had taught him the difference between settling and choosing. He spoke about loneliness and community, about the family you're born into and the family you create, about the particular courage required to live honestly when honesty comes at a cost. His words carried the weight of experience, and I listened with the desperate attention of someone trying to learn a language I needed to survive. The moment of truth arrived on a Saturday afternoon in December, announced by the familiar sound of Elaine's car in the driveway. I watched through the window as she gathered herself before approaching the door, the way she always did when preparing for a difficult conversation. She had called the night before to say she wanted to collect some belongings she had left behind, but I could hear in her voice that there was more to this visit than mere logistics. She looked well when I opened the door, more relaxed than I had seen her in years. There was something different in her posture, a kind of ease that suggested she had found her footing in her new life in ways that surprised us both. We made polite conversation as she gathered books and kitchen items, the careful dance of two people who had shared a life but no longer knew how to be in the same room together. But as the afternoon progressed, I felt her watching me with new attention, as if she were seeing something in me that she hadn't noticed before. When I mentioned Adrian's help with the ceiling repair, when I spoke about our shared meals and conversations, she tilted her head slightly, the way she always did when she was trying to solve a puzzle. It was when I was helping her carry boxes to her car that she asked the question I had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. She said I seemed different, more present somehow, and she wondered if there was someone new in my life. The question hung between us and the winter air, simple and complex at once, and I felt the familiar urge to deflect, to maintain the careful boundaries that had characterized our relationship for so long. Instead, I found myself telling her the truth. Not all of it, not the details she didn't need to know, but the essential fact that yes, there was someone, and that someone was helping me understand things about myself that I had never been willing to examine. I told her that I was sorry for all the years I had asked her to love someone who wasn't fully present, who was holding back parts of himself he didn't even know existed. The conversation that followed was quiet and painful and more honest than any we had shared during our marriage. She said she had always sensed there was something I was keeping from her, some essential part of myself that remained locked away even in our most intimate moments. She said she had blamed herself for not being able to reach it, for not being the kind of person who could inspire complete honesty. We talked about the years we had spent trying to make a life together out of expectation rather than truth, about the way we had both performed the roles of husband and wife, without ever quite understanding what we were performing for. There was sadness in the conversation, but also relief, the peculiar comfort that comes from finally naming something that has been present but unspoken for years. When she asked directly if I was in love with someone else, I found myself saying yes before I could second-guess the answer. And when she asked, with the careful gentleness of someone who already suspected the truth, if that someone was a man, I nodded, feeling something heavy and long-held finally release from my chest. She was quiet for a long moment, leaning against her car in the winter twilight, processing this information that reframed our entire history together. When she finally spoke, it was to say that she was sorry I had felt I couldn't tell her sooner, sorry that I had carried this alone for so long, sorry that our marriage had been built on a foundation that couldn't support the weight of complete honesty. There was grace in her response that I hadn't expected, a kind of understanding that suggested she was relieved to finally have an explanation for the distance that had always existed between us. We hugged goodbye with more warmth than we had shared in years, and I watched her drive away feeling like I had just been released from a prison I hadn't realized I was in. That night, I stood at the bottom of the stairs leading to Adrian's apartment, knowing that this was the moment when everything would change irrevocably. I could continue living in the space between worlds, maintaining the careful balance between truth and performance that had sustained me for so long. Or I could climb those stairs and choose the life I actually wanted, regardless of the cost. I knocked on his door with hands that shook but a heart that was finally clear. When he opened it, when I saw the question in his eyes and the careful hope he was trying not to show, I found my voice. I told him I wanted this, wanted us, wanted to stop living like someone who was afraid of his own life. My voice shook as I spoke, but my eyes were steady, and I knew that whatever came next, I was finally, completely myself. 3 months later, I found myself packing the last box of what I had come to think of as my previous life. The wedding ring sat in my palm for a moment, catching the morning light the same way it had that evening when everything began to change. But this time, when I set it down, it was into a box marked for donation, nestled between photo albums in China that belonged to people we no longer were. The weight of it felt different now, not heavy with failure, but light with completion. I taped the box shut with the same care I had once used to grade papers, methodical and thorough, but without the mechanical detachment that had characterized so much of my adult life. This was ceremony, ritual, the conscious act of closing one chapter so another could begin. I carried the box out to the garage, where it would wait with others for the charity pickup I had scheduled for later in the week. The garage felt different too, no longer a storage space for the detritus of a marriage that had outlived its purpose, but simply a room where things waited to find their way to people who might actually need them. Upstairs, I could hear Adrian moving around his kitchen, the familiar sounds of someone preparing a meal with attention and care. These sounds had become the soundtrack to my evenings, the rhythm against which I now measured my days. But tonight felt different, charged not with the nervous energy of new love, but with something deeper and more sustainable. The quiet peace of two people who had chosen each other deliberately and were learning how to build a life that honored that choice. When I climbed the stairs, I found him standing at the stove, stirring something that smelled like home. He looked up when I entered, offering the kind of smile that had become as essential to my well-being as breathing. We had learned to move around each other in the small kitchen with an ease that still surprised me, our bodies finding their own choreography without conscious thought. I set the table while he finished cooking, laying out 2 plates, 2 napkins, 2 glasses for the wine we would share. Just 2 this time. No empty place settings for ghosts who would never arrive. The simple mathematics of it filled me with a satisfaction I hadn't known I was capable of feeling. We ate dinner as we had learned to do, with conversation that flowed easily between the significant and the mundane, between plans for tomorrow and reflections on the strange journey that had brought us here. Adrian told me about a cabinet project he was excited to start, about wood grain and joinery techniques with the passion of someone who had found his calling. I shared stories from my classroom, about students who were beginning to understand that poetry wasn't just academic exercise, but a way of naming the world more precisely. The ease between us felt miraculous and ordinary at once, the way I imagined other people must feel when they talked about being truly comfortable with another person. There was no performance here, no careful editing of myself to fit expectations I had spent decades trying to meet. Just the simple pleasure of being known completely and accepted anyway. After dinner, we moved to the couch with the last of the wine, settling into our usual positions with the unconscious familiarity of people who had found their rhythm. Adrian picked up the guitar that lived in the corner, fingers finding melodies that drifted through the room like gentle rain. I read from a book of poems I had been sharing with him, verses about love found late and the courage required to claim it. As the evening wound down, I found myself standing at the window, looking out at the street where I had spent the better part of a year learning how to live honestly. The view was the same, but everything else had changed, including the man looking through the glass. A soft rain had begun to fall, the kind of gentle precipitation that nourishes without violence, and I watched it pattern the window with the same fascination I had once felt watching my students discover something true in a poem. Adrian joined me at the window, his hand coming to rest on my shoulder with the casual intimacy of someone who belonged there. The touch was light but grounding, a reminder that I was no longer standing anywhere alone. Through the glass, I could see lights in the neighboring houses, evidence of other lives being lived with varying degrees of authenticity and joy. But for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't envying anyone else's existence or wondering if I was missing something essential. I wasn't performing happiness or enduring emptiness or waiting for permission to want what I wanted. I was simply here, in this moment, with this man, breathing freely in the space we had created together. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the window, but unlike that storm months ago that had brought Adrian into my kitchen with tools and competence and the beginning of everything, this rain felt like blessing rather than crisis. I was no longer afraid of what weather might bring, no longer bracing against every change as potential catastrophe. Adrian's fingers tightened slightly on my shoulder, and I leaned back against the solid warmth of his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, the quiet certainty of his presence. We stood there without speaking, watching the rain transform the familiar street into something new and shining, and I understood that this was what peace felt like, not the absence of storm, but the knowledge that whatever came, you wouldn't face it alone. The man I had been, the one who sat at kitchen tables set for two, but eating alone, who removed his wedding ring like shedding a skin that no longer fit, who opened his door to a landlord and accidentally let in the possibility of love. That man felt like someone I had known in another lifetime. This man, the one standing at the window with rain blessing the glass and a hand warm on his shoulder, was someone I was still learning to be, but someone I finally recognized as myself.